My brother stole $400K and got my wife pregnant. But when I installed hidden cameras, I legally destroyed them all, and now they're bankrupt. I'm 34 years old. I work in artificial intelligence for a pretty big tech company in Boston, and honestly, I never thought I'd be writing this. But I need to get it out of my system, because what happened basically destroyed any concept I had about family and trust. I guess I should start at the beginning. When I was a kid and my brother Blake was born, because that's where it all really started. Even though at the time I had no idea what was coming. I was like 8 years old when Blake was born, and I swear, from the moment that kid came home, it was like I stopped existing to my parents. It's not that it was one of those subtle favoritism cases, where you have to read between the lines to figure it out. No, this was obvious even to an 8-year-old. Blake was the golden baby, the miracle, the perfect son who could do whatever he wanted without consequences. I remember one time I got all A's on my report card. You know what my parents said to me? Nothing. Literally, nothing. Because that same day, Blake took his first steps, and that was the only thing that mattered. I must have been like 9 years old, maybe 10, and I was already learning that it didn't matter what I did. I was never going to be enough for them. The thing is, I wasn't a problem child or anything like that. In fact, I was the opposite. I became super focused on school because I thought, well, if I get good grades, maybe they'll pay attention to me. How naive, right? Meanwhile, Blake could break my stuff, get in trouble at school, basically do whatever he wanted, and my parents always had an excuse for him. He's just a kid, they'd say, or he's going through a phase, or, my favorite, he needs more support because he's more sensitive. More sensitive, my ass. That kid was a manipulator from the moment he learned to talk. When I got to high school, I realized something, that if my parents weren't going to invest in me emotionally, then I wasn't going to depend on them for anything either. I became super independent, got part-time jobs, focused completely on my studies, especially math and science because I was good at them. Blake by then was like 6 or 7 years old and was already showing signs of being a compulsive liar, but my parents never disciplined him. One time I caught him stealing money from my backpack, like $50 I'd saved from my job at the supermarket, and when I told my parents about it, you know what happened? But they told me I probably lost it, and to stop accusing my little brother. That's when I really stopped trying to have a relationship with them. By the time I was in college, I basically didn't exist to my family anymore. I got a full scholarship to study computer science, specialized in artificial intelligence, and started publishing academic papers even before graduating. I got an exchange program in Seoul, South Korea, during my 3rd year, and it was like breathing for the first time in my life, being so far away from all that family drama. My parents didn't even ask how I was doing there, but they were always posting on Facebook about Blake's achievements, who by then was like 15 years old and had basically achieved nothing except getting expelled from 2 schools. After graduating, and yeah, my parents didn't come to my graduation because Blake had a baseball game that day. It wasn't even an important game, it was practice. I decided I was going to go back to Seoul permanently. I got an amazing job at a tech startup that was doing interesting things with machine learning, and honestly, it was the best decision of my life. I cut contact almost completely with my family. Just occasional calls on holidays where my parents basically asked me for money for Blake's projects. It was in Seoul where I met Melissa. She was American too, taught English at an international school, and when I met her, I thought she was perfect. Smart, funny. We shared the same sense of humor. We dated for like 2 years before, getting married, and it was a small wedding there in Seoul with friends we'd made in the city. My parents didn't come, obviously. Said they couldn't leave Blake alone. Blake was like 22 years old at that point, perfectly capable of taking care of himself. But, whatever. I'm not going to lie, it hurt. But I was so used to their rejection that I just accepted it and moved on. The next few years in Seoul were good, really good. My career took off. I started working for a bigger company with better projects. Melissa was happy with her job. We had a comfortable life in a nice apartment in Gangnam. I talked to my parents maybe once every 2 or 3 months, and it was always the same conversation, them asking if I could send them money to help Blake with some new business idea he had. One time it was a food truck, another time it was a dating app, then it was some cryptocurrency thing. I never sent them money because I knew Blake would just waste it. and they always made me feel guilty about it. Like I was the selfish son for not supporting my brother. And then, like 2 years ago, I got an offer I couldn't refuse. A senior position at an AI company in Cambridge, Massachusetts, basically in the Boston area. The salary was ridiculously good. We're talking over $300,000 a year, not counting bonuses and stock options, and it was exactly the type of work I'd been looking for. Melissa wasn't super excited about leaving Seoul, but she understood it was an incredible opportunity for my career. We moved back to the United States, got a nice house in a quiet neighborhood, and for the first time in years, I was geographically close to my family again. Not that I was planning on reconnecting with them, but it turns out Blake found out I'd come back. I don't know how. Probably my parents told him, and suddenly he started texting me. At first, I ignored them, because the last time I'd talked to him, he'd tried to sell me some multi-level marketing scheme, but he kept insisting. He said he'd changed, that he was going to therapy, that he wanted to rebuild our relationship as brothers. And I, like an idiot, thought, well, maybe people can change. Maybe I should give him a chance. Melissa also encouraged me to reconnect with him, said family was important and that I seemed to carry a lot of resentment, and I guess she was right about that last part at least. I told Blake we could meet for coffee, nothing serious, just to catch up. We met at a Starbucks near my work, and I have to admit he seemed different, more mature or something. He talked to me about how he'd been working on himself, how he'd realized he'd been a terrible brother, how our parents had spoiled him and he finally understood it. It sounded convincing. You know, over the next few months, Blake and I talked. Occasionally, nothing intense, just text messages here and there. Maybe we'd meet for lunch once a month. Melissa was happy I was reconnecting with my family, and she really pushed for us to invite him to the house. I was more cautious, still didn't completely trust him, but eventually I gave in. We invited him to dinner on a Friday night, and he was super charming with Melissa, making her laugh, asking about her work, acting like the perfect brother-in-law. After that night, Melissa told me she didn't understand why I'd been so distant from my family, that Blake seemed like a really great guy. The thing is, Melissa didn't know the whole story. I mean, I'd told her the basics about my childhood and the favoritism, but not all the specific details of the horrible things Blake had done over the years. She came from a super close and loving family, so for her the idea of cutting contact with your family was almost inconceivable. And I wanted to believe Blake had really changed, so I didn't push too hard to keep him away. This is where everything starts to go really wrong, but I didn't know it at the time. I had to travel to Seoul for work. It was a big project that required me to be there for a week, supervising the integration of a new system. It was the first time I'd traveled for work since we'd moved to Boston, and Melissa couldn't come with me because she had classes before I left. And here's the part that still drives me crazy when I think about it. Melissa told me she'd invited Blake to stay with her during the week because she didn't want to be alone in the house. I told her I didn't think it was a good idea, that we barely really knew Blake, but she insisted, said he was my brother and I was being paranoid. We had a small argument about it, but in the end I let her win because how bad could it go, right? I left for Seoul on a Monday morning, and during that week I talked to Melissa every day by video call. She seemed normal, maybe a bit more tired than usual, but I attributed it to work and being alone. She told me Blake had come for dinner a couple of times, that he was good company, that they were watching series together. No alarms went off in my head because I trusted Melissa completely. I'd never had reasons to doubt her. What I didn't know until later is that Blake didn't just come for dinner a couple of times, he literally stayed at our house all week. And I also didn't know until later that my parents were there too. They basically moved into my house while I was away, and Melissa never mentioned it to me. When I got back on Friday night, the house was empty. Melissa was alone, and everything seemed normal. She welcomed me, asked about the trip, we cooked dinner together, all super normal. There was no sign that anything was wrong. Like 3 weeks passed after my return, and one night Melissa told me she wanted to organize a family dinner, invite Blake and my parents. I wasn't super excited about the idea, but she said it would be good for me to reconnect more with my family, that Blake was really making an effort. I agreed because Melissa rarely asked for things like that, and I thought maybe she was right. Maybe it was time to try to have a more normal relationship with my parents and my brother. The dinner was on a Saturday night, and from the moment they arrived, I knew something was weird. Blake was acting strange, like too possessive with Melissa, pouring her wine, touching her shoulder when he talked, sitting too close to her. My parents were also acting weird, smiling at me in a way I'd never seen, being super nice to me, which was completely out of character. During dinner, Melissa announced she was pregnant, and everyone started congratulating us. But Blake, I swear, Blake had this strange smile on his face, like he knew something I didn't know. After everyone left that night, I asked Melissa if she'd noticed how weird Blake had been acting, and she got defensive, said I was being paranoid. Again, that Blake was just being friendly and excited about the baby, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. There was something about the way Blake had looked at her all night, something about the way my parents had treated me. Too nice, too interested in my life suddenly. I have security cameras in my house. You know, the typical smart home cameras that a lot of people have now, and normally I don't check them because I trust Melissa, but that feeling wouldn't leave me alone. I went to check the recordings from the week I was in Seoul, and here's the detail. Someone had deleted them. All the recordings from that week, they just weren't there anymore. That immediately put me on alert because why would someone delete the security camera recordings? And the only person who had access to the system besides me was Melissa. But it turns out I'm a software engineer who works in tech, and I'd set up an automatic cloud backup that Melissa didn't even know existed. The recordings automatically uploaded to a secure server that only I could access. It took me like an hour to find the right files and download them, and when I started watching them, honestly, I wished I hadn't. The first night I was away, Blake arrived at my house at like 7 in the evening with a suitcase. A suitcase. He stayed overnight. That night, nothing happened. He slept in the guest room, but the second night, and God, I still feel physically sick when I think about this. I saw them kissing in my living room. My wife and my brother, kissing in my living room, in my house. I kept watching the recordings, and it was all week, every day, in my bed, on the couch, in the kitchen, literally in every part of my house while I was in Seoul working. And worse still, my parents knew. They arrived on the third day and acted like it was completely normal for Blake to be sleeping with my wife. I saw them in the recordings, laughing together, cooking together, my parents treating Melissa like she was Blake's girlfriend. It was like a happy family week in my house, with my money. While I was literally on the other side of the world working, I didn't confront Melissa immediately. I needed to think. I needed to process it. I made copies of all the recordings, saved them in multiple secure places, and started reviewing our finances. It turns out Melissa had been transferring money from our joint account to an account I didn't recognize. Not huge amounts, but enough to be notable. Like $2,000 or $3,000 here and there over the last few months. I finally confronted them on a Tuesday night. Melissa came home from work, and I had my laptop open with the recordings ready. I told her, "Sit down, we need to talk." And I think she knew immediately that I knew, because her face changed completely. I showed her the videos, and at first she tried to deny it, say it wasn't what it looked like, but how do you explain videos of you literally having sex with your husband's brother? Eventually she broke down and admitted everything. According to her, Blake had seduced her, that he'd told her I didn't really love her, that I was married to my work, that he could make her happy in ways I couldn't. She told me she'd felt lonely, that the pregnancy had been an accident, that she didn't know if the baby was mine or Blake's, but she'd wanted to believe it was mine. Every word that came out of her mouth made me feel worse, like my chest was going to explode. I called Blake and told him to come to the house immediately, and when he arrived, he tried to act like he didn't know what I was talking about. But I showed him the videos, and that mask of innocence fell fast. To what he told me after? Honestly, I can't believe it even now. He told me Melissa was going to leave me anyway because I was a terrible husband, that he'd done her a favor, that at least now she could be with someone who really appreciated her. I yelled at him to get out of my house, and he had the nerve to tell me it was my fault for leaving her alone, that what did I expect would happen. My parents arrived like 20 minutes later. Blake had obviously called them, and instead of apologizing or showing any kind of remorse, they blamed me. My mother literally told me I'd been a selfish son all my life, that I'd always put my career before my family, that Blake and Melissa deserved to be happy together. My father said I should be grateful that Blake was willing to raise the baby even if it was mine, that it showed what kind of man he was. I stood there listening to my parents defend the son who slept with my wife, and it was like my whole life of being ignored and belittled by them crystallized in that moment. I threw them all out of my house that night, and the next day Melissa left to stay with her parents. I hired a lawyer immediately, a woman named Stephanie who'd been recommended to me, and we started divorce proceedings. I gave Stephanie all the recordings, all the financial records, everything. She told me I had a solid case not only for divorce, but potentially for more, depending on what else we found. Then something happened that I didn't see coming. My parents sued me. They literally sued me, demanding I give them $5,000 a month for Blake and $3,000 a month for Melissa, plus $50,000 so Blake could start his life with Melissa and the baby. Their argument was that I had the financial means, that as the older son, it was my responsibility to help my brother, and that Blake wasn't at fault for falling in love with Melissa. When Stephanie showed me the lawsuit, I laughed. Honestly, I laughed because it was so absurd I couldn't believe it. But Stephanie wasn't laughing. She told me we needed to build a case not just against Melissa, but against Blake too, that she suspected there was more going on than we knew. She asked me about Blake's history, all the things he'd done over the years, and I told her everything, all the schemes, all the scams, all the times he'd manipulated situations for his benefit. Stephanie told me she was going to hire a private investigator. What the investigator found was even worse than I'd imagined. Blake had been scamming people for years, small schemes here and there, nothing big enough to attract serious attention, but enough to have ruined several people. There was a woman who was like 65 years old who'd lent him $30,000 for a business that never existed. A young couple who'd invested their savings in one of his apps that never got developed. A guy who'd been his roommate and whose identity he'd stolen to open credit cards. Stephanie contacted all these victims and created a class action lawsuit against Blake for fraud. And here's where it gets really interesting. Some of these schemes had happened recently, and when we checked the dates, they coincided with the transfers Melissa had been making from our joint account. It turns out Melissa had been helping Blake scam people, using information she got from her students' parents since she was a teacher at an expensive private school, giving Blake access to people with money. When all this information came out in court, during the hearing for the divorce and my parents' lawsuit, the judge was visibly upset. My parents tried to argue that Blake had made those mistakes in the past, but now he'd changed. But Stephanie had evidence that they knew about the scams, that in fact they'd helped Blake flee from some of his previous victims, paying restitution under the table to avoid criminal charges. The judge not only dismissed my parents' lawsuit against me, but ordered a criminal investigation into Blake. Melissa lost her job when the school board found out she'd been using her position to obtain information from families for Blake's scheme. She tried to argue she didn't know it was illegal, that Blake had told her they were legitimate loans, but the text messages between them clearly showed she knew exactly what she was doing. The divorce was finalized in like 4 months, incredibly fast compared to usual. And I got everything. The house, the savings, everything. Melissa even had to return the money she'd transferred to Blake's account, though I only recovered a fraction because he'd already spent it. Blake tried to declare bankruptcy to avoid paying the class action restitution, but it didn't work because the judge ruled it was intentional fraud, not normal civil debt. My parents had to sell their house to pay legal fees, and part of the restitution the judge ordered them to pay as Blake's accomplices. They tried to contact me several times, leaving me voicemails calling me an ungrateful son, saying I'd destroyed my family by being vindictive, but I'd changed my number by then, and only Stephanie had a way to contact me for legal matters. Blake eventually fled to Florida. I don't know exactly why Florida, but apparently he thought he could hide there. He was arrested like 6 months later for trying to scam someone who turned out to be an undercover FBI agent working on a different case, but who recognized his name from the reports about our case. Last I heard, he was facing federal charges and probably going to prison for several years. As for the baby, Melissa gave birth like 5 months ago. A girl. I demanded a paternity test before she was born, and it turned out she was mine, which was its own kind of torture because now I have a daughter with a woman who betrayed me in the worst possible way. Melissa has physical custody because she's the mother and the baby is small, But I have visitation rights, and I'm not paying child support beyond the basic necessities because the judge took the financial fraud into account in his decision. I've seen my daughter 3 times, and I'm not going to lie, it's complicated. Part of me loves her because she's my daughter, but another part of me sees Melissa every time I look at her and I get furious again. I'm in therapy now, trying to process all this, because I don't want my daughter to grow up feeling like her father resents her for the decisions her mother made. Melissa tried to approach me like a month ago, showed up at my door with the baby, crying, saying it had been a terrible mistake, that Blake had manipulated her, that she still loved me. I have cameras at my door now, obviously, and I told her to leave or I'd call the police. She started screaming that I was a monster, that I'd ruined her life, that everything was my fault. I have that recording too, and Stephanie says we could use it if Melissa tries anything else. Blake tried the same thing like 2 weeks ago, showed up with Melissa again, both of them at my door demanding money, saying it was my responsibility to help them because they had no jobs and had a baby to support. I told them exactly the same thing, to leave or I'd call the police, and Blake told me if I didn't give them money they were going to go to the media. Tell their version of the story where I was the abusive and controlling husband who'd forced them to be together. I told them go ahead, that I had all the videos and all the records of their fraud, and that I'd be happy to share them with any journalist who wanted to listen. They left after that. My parents made one last attempt like a week ago, organized an intervention at their church with the pastor and several congregation members, calling me to tell me they needed to talk to me about forgiving my family. I went because Stephanie thought it would be good to have witnesses of whatever my parents tried. It turned out several of the church members were Blake's victims too. He'd been scamming elderly people from the congregation for years, and when this came out during the intervention, the pastor was furious. The intervention turned into a confrontation about all the times Blake had stolen from the church and my parents had covered it up. I left without saying a word, while my parents tried to explain why they hadn't reported Blake's thefts. Now I'm basically alone, which sounds depressing, but honestly, it's better than having those people in my life. My friends from Seoul still talk to me, support me, and I have some colleagues here in Boston who know parts of the story and have been good to me. My job is still going well. I just got promoted, actually. So, at least that part of my life is stable. As for my daughter, I don't know what's going to happen. Melissa is still trying to get work, but nobody wants to hire a teacher who lost her license for participating in fraud schemes. Blake is probably going to be in prison when my daughter is old enough to ask about him. My parents are trying to get visitation rights as grandparents, but Stephanie is fighting that because we have evidence they put Blake and Melissa together in my house knowing what was going to happen. Last week my daughter, her name is Emma by the way, though Melissa named her without my input, but whatever. I had her for a few hours at my house. She's tiny. She's like 5 months old now. And when I held her in my arms, something inside me broke a little. She wasn't at fault for any of this, you know. She's just a baby who was born in the middle of this mess. I'm trying to figure out how to be a good father to her while keeping her mother and the rest of my biological family completely out of my life. It's complicated, it's painful, but I'm working on it. I guess the lesson here, if there is one, is that some people never change, and when they show you who they really are, you should believe them the first time. Blake was a liar and manipulator since childhood, and I knew it. But I wanted to believe people can change. My parents showed their favoritism and their willingness to enable Blake's behavior from the beginning, and I spent years hoping they'd eventually see me, that they'd eventually value me, but they never did. And Melissa, well, maybe there were signs I didn't see, or maybe she really was seduced. I don't know, and honestly, I don't care anymore. The only thing I know is I have a daughter who deserves better than all this, and I'm going to do everything possible to make sure she grows up without all this toxicity. Whether that means fighting for more custody when she's older, or just being a stable and present father during my visits, I don't know yet. But I'm not going to be like my parents, that's for sure. Emma is going to know she's loved, that she's valued, no matter what.